All right, today we're diving into a story that honestly feels like it's been ripped straight from a sci-fi script. It's a tale that seems to bend the very rules of reality. We're talking about the impossible return of Flight 914. I mean, seriously, think about it. Could a plane just vanish for 37 years and then pop back into existence? It sounds totally nuts, right? But for decades, a lot of people were convinced this was the true story of Pan Am Flight 914. So let's get into the legend and see what all the fuss is about. Okay, so let's set the scene. Picture this. It's a bright, clear morning, July 2nd, 1955. We're in New York. On the tarmac, you've got Pan Am Flight 914, an old Douglas DC-4 with 57 souls on board. They're all set for what should be a totally routine 3-hour hop down to Miami. Everything's looking perfectly normal. And for a while, it was perfectly normal. The flight took off right on time, everything proceeding just as planned. But then, less than 2 hours into the flight, it just blinked off the radar. Gone. And the crazy part, there was no distress call, no warning, no mayday, nothing. It just vanished. You can imagine the panic that followed. A massive search was launched, like immediately. We're talking the Navy, the Coast Guard, everyone scouring the Atlantic all along the flight path. They searched for days and days and found absolutely nothing. Not a single piece of wreckage, no oil slick, not one bit of debris. It was as if the plane and everyone on it just dissolved into thin air. So after 10 long days of finding nothing, the authorities had to make that awful call. They made the grim announcement. The flight was presumed crashed, lost at sea. No survivors. For the families, it was an unimaginable tragedy with zero closure. And for the official record, the case was stamped closed. But, as you've probably guessed, this was far, far from the end of the story. Right. This is the moment where a sad, tragic aviation mystery completely transforms into something else, a modern legend, a story so bizarre it still captures people's imagination. So buckle up, because we're about to fast forward, jumping decades into the future. 37 years. Think about that for a second. An entire generation had grown up. Pan Am, which was this absolute giant of the skies back in the day, had actually gone out of business just the year before. The world had completely changed. It had moved on. Okay, so now the date is September 9th, 1992. We're at the airport in Caracas, Venezuela. It's just another busy morning. Planes landing, taking off, the usual chaos. And then the air traffic controllers spot something weird, something baffling. It's an old propeller plane, and it's approaching without any authorization. It wasn't on any of their schedules. And then the radio crackles to life. Can you just imagine the absolute shock in that control tower? The controller, a guy named Juan de la Corte, gets this call. The pilot calmly identifies himself as Captain Miguel Victor of Pan Am Flight 914, a flight that, according to every single record, had completely vanished without a trace 37 years ago. No way. So they guide this ghost plane in for a landing, and what they see is just mind-blowing. This is not a modern jet. It's a vintage DC-4, looking old and weathered. And then the doors open, and passengers start peering out, and they're all dressed in clothes straight out of the 1950s. It was literally a living, breathing time capsule sitting right there on the tarmac. So as you can imagine, on the ground, confusion just explodes into total chaos. The authorities are scrambling, trying to figure out what in the world is going on. And of course, the wildest theories start flying around. I mean, how could this even be possible? The disconnect between the pilot and the control tower was just staggering. From the pilot's end, he's calm, but he's confused. He's asking for directions to Miami, thinking only a few hours have passed. And then the control tower has to tell him, "Sir, you are thousands of kilometers off course." And by the way, the year is 1992. You can just picture the pilot's radio going completely silent with shock. So ground crews start to approach the plane. And suddenly, Captain Victor starts panicking over the radio. He's yelling, "No, stay away, we're leaving now." And before anyone can stop him, he fires up the engines, taxis back onto the runway without any clearance, and just takes off. The plane climbs back into the clouds, and then, for the second time, it vanishes. So let's just recap, because this is wild. A flight disappears in 1955. It reappears in 1992 with passengers who haven't aged a single day, only to vanish all over again. It completely defies all logical explanation. So this has to be the ultimate proof of time travel, right? Well, maybe not. Okay, so every great myth usually has a tiny kernel of something, and a story this good, this unbelievable, absolutely demands a real investigation. So now it's time for us to put on our detective hats and separate this fantastic story from the cold, hard reality. Look, the story of Flight 914 is incredibly compelling. It's the perfect mystery, you can't deny that. But here's the thing, when you actually start digging for real evidence, official reports, actual news articles from 55 or 92, anything from a credible source, you find crickets. Nothing. Because, as it turns out, the story has a very, very different origin. Okay, let me introduce you to the main source of this entire legend, a little publication called the Weekly World News. If you're not familiar with it, this was a supermarket tabloid that was famous for headlines like "Elvis is alive" or "Bat Boy escapes cave." It specialized in fantastic, super entertaining, and, yeah, completely fabricated stories. And back in the late 80s and 90s, they absolutely loved the story of Flight 914. So let's just break this down. Legend versus fact. The legend says, Flight 914 vanished. The fact, not a single major airline has any record of a Flight 914 ever going missing. Not one. What about the eyewitness, Juan de la Corte? Well, the photo they used for him was just a stock photo they used in other fake stories too. And get this, the tabloid actually published the story multiple times, and they just kept changing the year the plane returned to keep the story fresh. First it was 1985, then it was 1992. So the big question is, if none of this actually happened, where did this incredibly detailed story even come from? Well, what we have here is a perfect case study in how a simple piece of fiction can balloon into a global urban legend that honestly people still believe to this day. It really breaks down into a simple, four-step recipe for a modern myth. Step 1, a writer makes up a cool fictional story just for entertainment. Step 2, a sensationalist tabloid like the Weekly World News picks it up and blasts it out to a massive audience. Step 3, they keep reprinting the story over the years, adding new details to make it seem more legit. And then, Step 4, the internet happens, and the web just strips away all the original context, the fact that it came from a goofy tabloid, and the story gets shared over and over again as if it's a real, genuine mystery. So let's just be absolutely crystal clear here. The story of Pan Am Flight 914 is 100% fiction. There was no flight, there was no disappearance, and there was certainly no impossible return. It's really just an amazing testament to how a really well-told story, especially one that taps into our fascination with the unknown, can take on a life of its own and far outlive the silly newspaper it was first printed on. And that really leaves us with one final thought. The facts are clear, right? The case is totally debunked. And yet, the story of Flight 914 endures. It's still out there. And it kind of makes you wonder, maybe the point isn't whether it's true. Maybe the more interesting question is why so many of us want it to be true. What does our love for a story like this say about us? About our desire for a world that still has a little bit of magic and mystery left in it?